Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Munir Majid, and I'd like to welcome you to this kickoff session of the LSE Forum. And suitably, this kickoff session is looking at the context within which Asia exists and the problems and issues it might face even as it seeks to grow and rise. And in this particular session, we have with us Professor Arne Westad, who is Professor of History as well as Director of LSE Ideas. Arne is a leading expert on China, and his last book, The Restless Empire, China and the World Since 1750, won the Bernard Short's Prize, book prize. And if you hadn't read the book, I'm not saying you should buy it, but if you hadn't read it, you must read it. And as director of LSE Ideas, which is just over 6 years old, he has brought it to a peak of achievement which has been recognized. Indeed, Ideas has been recognized as the second leading think tank, university-linked think tank in the world. Now, don't ask me who's first, I forget. Now, Arne will lead the discussion this morning in 20 minutes, and we have to be very strict about timekeeping, after which we have two respondents. On the one hand, we will have Professor Wenzhao, the influential Professor Tao, from the Institute of American Studies and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Professor Tao will be followed by my old friend, Hassan Wirajuda, still influential, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia. And after Arne's 20 minutes, the respondents will speak for 10 minutes each, after which, in time-honored LSE fashion, we will open it to the floor. And when we do so, please be direct, don't make speeches, to get more chance and time for people to bring up issues that would have arisen as a result of the presentations, or indeed that you may have, which is new and not being brought to the discussion. Therefore, I look forward to your participation for the last half an hour of our session after the 40 minutes of the presentations by the main speaker, Arne Westad, and the two respondents. So on that note, may I quickly invite Arne to set the scene. Arne.
Thank you very much, Munir. It's a great pleasure to be back in KL, to be back in Malaysia. I often confess this freely. It's one of my favorite countries, and it is great to have a chance to address you all this morning. My thanks to Munir for chairing this session. Munir is much too modest to mention his own central significance in terms of the building of LSE Ideas, the LSE Center for International Affairs, Diplomacy and Strategy. He's been a key participant in the building of that center from the very beginning. And I'm extremely grateful to him for chairing, for his kind words of introduction. I'm also very grateful to my old friends, Professor Wenzhao, who I've known for more than 25 years now, and Dr. Hassan Wirajuda, the former Indonesian foreign minister, who I also known for quite some time, and who has been, as all of you here will know, a very influential builder for the international structure within this region. So my main topic today takes off very directly from where Prime Minister Najib's opening speech ended, on the note of change happening very fast on a global scale. And change is happening nowhere faster than what it is within this region in a very broad sense. And one of the great privileges of my career and my life has been to follow this development in Asia, and particularly in Eastern Asia, including this region. In terms of developments, this has moved in directions that no one would have been able to foresee just a few years ago. And it's important to stress, since most of what I have to say will be about international affairs, some of which is very tricky, very problematic, very challenging, that first and foremost this change is about development at the human level. And that's mainly a story about change for the better. It's about how people have been able to take control of and to change, transform their own lives. And if I may say so with reference to my two commentators today, nowhere is that more visible than in China and in Indonesia. 50 years ago, those two countries were entering one of the darkest periods in their history, mainly based on social strife, political strife, and oppression. But look at the two countries today in terms of where they are. Both have gone through transformations that have an enormous significance for this whole region. Indonesia has become the world's biggest Muslim democracy. It is a state that has been moving from strength to strength over the past decade in terms of not just international relations that it's at the core of, but also in terms of its domestic development. China is the envy of the world in terms of economic development and has highlighted many of the issues that needs to be taken forward on a global scale in terms of lifting people out of poverty. So if we compare what's happening today with what happened 50 years ago, you can see the progress that I'm talking about. I think that Asia will be key to global developments in the next generation. If you want to study one particular area in terms of its international affairs, this is to the young people who are here, look at Asia and look at this region in particular. Some of this is, of course, connected to economics, and we'll hear more about that from Danny Kwa and other colleagues later on in the afternoon session. It is about the economic center of gravity shifting. To me, as an historian, it's important to point out that this is in line with what has been the case for most of human existence. It's really only over the last 100, maybe 120 years that Europe and its North American offshoot has been at the center of global economic developments. Traditionally, that role has belonged to Asia because of its population size, but also because of the trajectory of its historical development. So what we are seeing now is, in a way, a reversion to what the order of things have been for a very, very long time indeed, and therefore should come as no surprise. Neither should it come as a surprise that China is at the center of this development. And this has nothing to do with Sinocentrism. This has nothing to do with China's overall cultural role or its central position within the region. It has to do with China's size, and it has to do with the size of China's population. We are not, I think, in our day and time heading back to where this region was when my last book started in the 18th century, towards a old-fashioned form of Sinocentric system. I think we are heading towards a period in which China's interaction with the rest of the region, and hopefully also globally, will expand. But have no doubts about it. China's position is going to be central, and it's going to be vital for what happens here and what happens within the wider region. Now, there are some difficulties and some problems connected with these changes that are taking place in an international sense. And let me just outline some of them. I won't be able to deal with all of the issues that are of significance, but I'll outline some that I think are particularly important so that we can have a free and open discussion about those here. I will, at the end of my talk, come to this particular region. So I want to put the focus on the international affairs of Southeast Asia, and particularly its relationship with China, again, linking up to what Pak Hassan and Wenzhao will be commenting on later on. Now, one key in terms of the international development of the Eastern Asian region, maybe the key in many ways, at least for the foreseeable future, will be the relationship between China and Japan. Deng Xiaoping, who led China for a very long period of time and was one of the wisest foreign policy makers that I've ever come across, used to say that China cannot rise against Japan. It can only rise with Japan. And I think he was entirely right. I think it is very, very important that the relationship between China and Japan becomes more stable than what it is today, not just for those two countries, and if I may say so, especially for China, which is still the rising power within the region. But this is also important, of course, for the wider region, and it's important for the world. Having the second and third largest economies in the world at odds, as what seems to be the way that we are heading at the moment, is not good for anyone. And it doesn't point in the direction that the outside world would like to see with regard to peace and cooperation within the region. The situation on the Korean Peninsula, as you will know, is also very difficult. I'm among those who tend to underline the signal significance that the resolution to the Korean problems of various sorts that are there will have not just for the Asian region, but for the whole world. Korea is one of the most difficult, intractable, but also potentially dangerous conflicts that we are facing at the moment. And the reduction of tension, including the abolition of nuclear weapons in North Korea, is a key to the future of the region, of the world, but particularly for those countries bordering on Korea in Asia's northeast. For China, one of the key issues in terms of its international development has always been the relationship to the South, has been the relationship to this part of the world. When I first came to China in the late 1970s, I remember a lot of discussion about how China connected to Southeast Asia. And it was mainly a discussion about things that had not developed well since the middle part of the 20th century. So in the 1980s and in the 1990s, an enormous amount of work was put in from both sides, both from China and from the Southeast Asian countries, to improve that relationship. And enormous successes were had in the process. There was a tremendous change in the relationship from conflict towards cooperation, towards China and Southeast Asia working together. Over the past 5 years, I'm sorry to say, I think some of that goodwill in terms of the overall relationships have gone out the window. And it raises some very serious questions about whether the rise of China will mean conflict or opportunities for further cooperation. I think the opportunities are enormous, and we'll hear more about that later on today. The economic prospects for a cooperation between China and Southeast Asia have developed very well over the past 25 years, culminating, of course, in the signing of the treaty leading to a free trade zone that can incorporate the Chinese and the Southeast Asian economies on an equal basis. The ability of the two sides to make use of these opportunities is vital. It is through trade, through investment, as the Prime Minister was saying, in terms of open markets, that the future of China and Southeast Asia can be linked in a positive form. But there are also tensions that sometimes can get in the way of these kinds of cooperation, these forms of immediate attempts at linking different regions of the world together. In the relationship between China and the ASEAN countries, this has mainly been tensions over control of sea-based resources with regard to the South China Sea. And let me just conclude with a few remarks, in my view, of how we can try to approach that particular conflict as an example of how it would be possible to use the knowledge that we have now about international affairs to move more closely to a resolution of overall international disputes. What is clear, I think, is that China and the various Southeast Asian countries need to negotiate on questions relating to the South China Sea. Compromises are perfectly possible. This is not the kind of position which is intractable in the sense that the conflict is doomed to go on for a very, very long time. It's easy to see, as my Chinese friends sometimes put this in Beijing, how you could turn this into a win-win situation for everyone involved. But in order for that to happen, negotiations are central. They are essential for the road forward. And at the moment, negotiations with the aim of setting up mutual compromises have not been developing well. I think one road towards the future with regard to the South China Sea conflict is to look at negotiations that have already been conducted elsewhere within the terms of the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, and try to emulate what has been happening, particularly at the opening phase of some of these international negotiations. I know that Hassan and others have been very interested in this in terms of looking at examples from elsewhere. This is in part what the academic community would be able to provide. And we have people at LSE who've been working very closely with policymakers in order to develop these kinds of perspectives. I also think it is important, and this is of particular significance on the Chinese side, to take the role of the regional organization in this area, the ASEAN organization, more seriously than it does presently in terms of all negotiations. I think it will be very hard to find individual solutions to the South China Sea conflict, or indeed other kinds of issues that may come up in the future between the countries of this region and countries elsewhere. This is a positive aspect of what has been happening in Southeast Asia. It is to the enormous advantage of this region, and possibly also for its neighbors, that there is an integrationist regional organization that actually works quite well, and that has an enormous potential for the future. Trying to make use of that organization in order to deal with all kinds of international issues, including those that deal with countries that neighbor the Southeast Asian region, can only be for the positive. I'm also among those who believe that a joint exploration and production in some regions is entirely possible, even if agreement has not been reached on dividing lines in legal terms. A lot of experience that we have elsewhere, from the North Sea to the Caribbean to off the coast of West Africa, show that it is indeed possible to start moving towards joint projects that can show the way forward in terms of collaboration on a much wider scale, even if there is no absolute certainty in terms of dividing lines. Now, this will always have to be, I think, a minority phenomenon. But denying, as some people now do in this region and elsewhere, that it's possible is, in my view, entirely wrong. I also think it's important to underline how the region, how China, how other powers deal with the role of the United States with regard to this conflict, and also in the much broader sense of what is happening internationally. The role of the United States, of course, should be both to stabilize the situation in the region and to further negotiations for solutions that would be to the benefit of the region and the international community as a whole. But of course, the American role could also turn in a more negative direction. The ASEAN countries are, as all countries, free to choose their own security arrangements, and they have done so wisely now for more than 2 generations. I do think it is important, though, and particularly with regard to the future role of the United States within the Eastern Asian region in general, that these security arrangements have to be explicit and as far as possible done within existing regional frameworks. That is the only way in which these kinds of arrangements can work. I think the ASEAN countries have to realize that in some cases, some self-imposed limitations with regard to bases, with regard to security treaties, particularly with the United States, will help build future relations both within the region itself and with its neighbors, including China. First and foremost, though, and I'll end on this note, China needs to be seen as a supporter of regional integration, rather than the opposite. China's future in Southeast Asia is linked to ASEAN as an organization, rather than just to the individual countries that in so many cases the Chinese government are trying to deal with in terms of the negotiation strategy. This is about integration on a much wider scale than what just has to do with Southeast Asia itself. And this, to me, is the most important aspect of what can be achieved. If it is possible to link other countries in, not just China, but other countries within the Eastern Asian region, but also possibly towards South Asia, into the same kind of framework and ideas that has helped build ASEAN now over 2 generations, I think a lot can be accomplished. Because this is not just about organization. It is about the concepts of cooperation that go into it. And that, I think, will perhaps be the most important lesson in terms of international affairs that can go from this region to the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Arne. And I think one of the points that Arne makes is China is at the center. Now, is it for better or for worse? So with that provocative introduction, can I ask Professor Tao to come and make his comments, please?
Here? Okay. Well, thank you, Professor Cajon and Professor Westad to invite me to participate in this very important and interesting forum. My old friend Arne raised a lot of questions, a number of questions, generally about China's relations with neighboring countries. I don't know whether I can answer all these questions, but I will make a response as much as possible. First, the Sino-Japanese relations. I think there are 2 outstanding issues in the relationship between China and Japan. One is the Diaoyu Islands issue. One is a historical issue. With the Diaoyu Islands issue, when China and Japan normalized their relations in 1972, and when the 2 countries concluded the peace treaty in 1978, there's a consensus between China and Japan. We share that issue. But now that old consensus was broken. It was broken by Japan's so-called naturalization of the Senkaku Islands. And now both Chinese and Japan are patrolling within the 12 miles of the Diaoyu Islands. Both were patrolling. If the time for final solution of the territorial issue is not ripe yet, then my suggestion would be to reach a new consensus. We share that issue. But that new consensus must reflect the fact that this is a controversial territory. Then we can share that China and Japan are number 2, number 3, or the largest economies. We have a deep interdependence between ourselves. Actually, as Arne just said, Wen Xiaoping just launched the Reform and Openness. He first visited Japan. And after visiting Japan, he said, now I realized what was the modernization. So we have to continue to cooperate economically. And with historical factor, I think Japan should stick to the past statement about the war crime, about the sex slavery issue, etc. And the Japanese leaders, especially Prime Minister, should stop visiting Yasukuni Shrine. That will be fine. Actually, Sino-Japanese relations between 2006 and 2011 were quite good. And I was joined the joint historical research with Japanese scholars. With the Korean issue, yes, it is a dangerous place. But the Chinese government has made several times the announcement: we would not let anyone to create any trouble or any war on China's border. And in November 2011, the Chinese and Russia released a joint statement: we will never allow the war break out on the Korean Peninsula again. So actually, I'm not very much afraid of the Korea. I think Korea's situation is more or less under control, because all the countries, all the big powers, United States, China, Russia, of course Japan, do not want the war on the Korean Peninsula. The more complicated issue, of course, is China's relationship with the ASEAN countries. Yes. Well, in the past 20 plus years, China implemented a good neighborliness policy towards its neighbors, and this was quite successful. And China got a lot of benefits from that good neighborliness policy, and China will continue to do so. So we have territorial and maritime issues, disputes with some of the ASEAN countries, not with all of them. Yeah. But those disputes are not the all relationship with those countries. For instance, we have disputes with Vietnam, we will have disputes with the Philippines, but this is not the whole overall Sino-Vietnamese relationship. It's not the overall Sino-Philippine relationship. And even we have some disputes, we can still cooperate. You know, when Premier Li Keqiang visited Vietnam last year, the two governments agreed to cooperate in 3 big areas: in land, on sea, and in finance. And when President Xi Jinping made a telephone call to the Vietnamese party secretary, the two leaders confirmed their cooperations. So this is, of course, outstanding issue, and today it catches a lot of media attention. But I think it's not the total picture of China's relationship with the ASEAN countries. While, on the contrary, Chinese leaders in recent years put forward a new concept, so-called community of a common destiny. Yeah. Because China and the surrounding countries are so interdependent between themselves. China is #1 trade partner and economic partner of ASEAN countries. Of course, also Japan and Korea. Yeah. And development is the common goal of all of us. Yeah. And the cooperation, we have been cooperating for many years, and cooperation produced a lot of benefits to all of us, and we will continue cooperation. And today, after 30 plus years development, China has more strengths to provide. We will have, for instance, financial support and also technological support, so we can have more channels to cooperate. And last year, President Xi Jinping put forward the so-called Silk Road Economic Belt and the Maritime Silk Road. So we want to expand cooperation between China and other countries, including ASEAN countries. And of course, we still have differences. Those differences we can through dialogue, consultation, and peaceful negotiation. And now I think China and other countries are discussing about COC. Yeah, and of course the process is not very smooth, but the process is moving. Yeah, so I'm not that pessimistic. Yeah, the issue was left by the history. When I was a small kid, in the primary school, I learned geography, and I began to learn that the islands in South China Sea belong to China. That was in 1940s, you know. Yeah, so every Chinese since they are very young, believed that the islands in South China Sea belong to China. So it is difficult, but we also recognize that other countries also have territorial claimants, and we are ready, we agree to negotiate with them directly, with those direct claimants. Yeah. So I think these differences should not become an obstacle in our cooperation. I'll stop here. Oh, I have one thing to add. That is Sino-American relations. Yeah, because I personally is an expert on Sino-American relations, and Sino-American relations are so important to Asia's future. Last June, President Xi Jinping met with President Obama in Sunnylands, California, and that meeting was really unusual in the breadth and length of the discussion. Yeah. The two leaders made a firm commitment to building a new type of a major power relationship. And Xi Jinping summarized that new type of relationship in 3 terms. One, no conflict, no confrontation. The other, mutual respect. And then, win-win cooperation. Here, I would like to offer my brief understanding of these 3 principles. No conflict, no confrontation. You know, in the past 30 plus years, China tried hard to integrate itself into the world community. And the United States in general did not reject China's integration into the present regime. So China got tremendous development, and the United States also got benefit from China's integration into the world community. So that's why President George W. Bush's Deputy Secretary Bob Zoellick can say China should be the responsible stakeholder of the present regime. Yeah. And China did that, and China will continue to do so. So we had no conflict and confrontation between China and the US. So our relationship actually today is a new type of major power relationship, because this relationship was different from Britain-German relationship before World War I, different from the US-Japan relationship before Pearl Harbor, different from the US-Soviet Union relationship during the Cold War. But why should we advance the new concept at present? Because of a lot of changes in the US, in China, and also in the world situation. And one change is that the gap between US and China is very much narrowed. Now China is number 2 economy in the world, and probably under Xi and Li, China will catch up the United States in total GDP. So American people are not prepared to accept that kind of China. So, you know, American people's feeling began to change. So we should emphasize that. And for the mutual respect, I think here means 2 things. One is respect for each other's social system and ideology. The other is respect for core interests. Since President Nixon's visit in early 1970s, I think actually China and the US have already reached a tacit consensus. That is, China and the US do not like each other's system and ideology very much. Yeah. But the other's system and ideology will be there indefinitely. And each side has little to do to influence the other's ideology and social system. Yeah. So this consensus, I think, exists even today. Although we still have differences over human rights, but you can see this is just one issue in comprehensive Sino-American relations. So I'm using out my time. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Zhao. Well, I'm sure there'll be questions and issues on China arising from both Arne's points and Professor Tao's points for later. We reserve it for later. And one of the other points that has been made by Arne is on ASEAN and the region and Indonesia. The point is ASEAN must come through, must come good. It's almost like a difficult childbirth, you know, it hasn't really sort of expressed itself in an effective way as the other countries maneuver and you know, bring issues to it. So I think Pak Hassan Wirajuda is well placed as former foreign minister of Indonesia and still advisor to the president on foreign policy to bring us some perspectives to the issue that we are discussing from the Indonesian experience and how Indonesia sees ASEAN, you know, playing its role and being more effective in negotiating with the big powers in our part of the world. Hassan?
Thank you, Tan Sri. First of all, I would like to thank the LSE Asia Forum for inviting me to be panelist of the sessions. I'm pleased to be here with Professor Arne Westad, a good friend, and Tan Sri Datuk Majid, Munir Majid, which I've been knowing for some years by now. I'm not an LSE graduate myself, but I can claim that I'm a member of LSE, as my wife has graduated from LSE, and hopefully my son soon complete his PhD at the LSE. So I'm pleased for that matter to join the sessions. I'm trying to approach the problems that we are facing in these regions from the perspectives of the process of integrations, which is part of the theme of this conference. And I would argue that the situation that we are witnessing in these regions of East Asia is a product of an imbalanced concept of integrations, of a community building. I said imbalance because in the past 10 years, the community building process has been heavily economics and neglecting political and security cooperations or integrations. You may recall that the idea for this region to establish an ASEAN, rather an East Asian community, was initiated in 1997. And it is a byproduct of ASEAN dialogue process. The beauty of ASEAN is not that ASEAN promote integrations within 10 Southeast Asian family of nations, but ASEAN that has been very active in reaching out, ASEAN as a bridge builder, including to our partners in Northeast Asia, China, Japan, and Korea. We call them our +3 partners. But ASEAN that is playing a very important role because of those 3 partners. We cannot expect that they can play a role, important role as a leading or leaders in the process because of the heavy historical baggage that would not allow them to lead the process. That's why their dependence on ASEAN. It was in 1997 at the ASEAN +3 process that the idea to establish an ASEAN, rather an East Asian community was explored. The crucial issue was what a kind of vehicles that we are going to develop. And this was mainly considered an East Asian summit to be the main vehicle. But the crucial issue was what are the memberships. Most of the 13 countries argued that EAS, East Asia Summit, should be limited to 13 countries. Indonesia was the one who argued that it should be balanced and inclusive. East Asia Summit should not be defined in terms of geographical limitations, comprising of Northeast Asian and Southeast Asian countries, but also should include India, Australia, and New Zealand. Why need to have a balance? Because while China and others labels China's progress in the past 20 years as peaceful rise, but we make questions how long China remains peaceful if one day, now China is the second largest economy in the world, but also they have more money to spend on arms build-up, military build-up. We can anticipate that China, which one day becomes more restless, to use the Arne's term, but China that is more assertive, if not aggressive, in dealing with some issues they were facing in North China Sea as well as South China Sea. And in fact, as East Asia Summit held here in Kuala Lumpur for the first time in 2005, it was comprising of 16. But they are still, since then, continuing, or rather competing concept on what is called East Asia. On certain issues like the establishment of Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralisms, which is an arrangement for countries of the region to help each other in facing potential financial crisis. It is strictly limited to 13, meaning 10 ASEAN countries plus China, Japan, and Korea, and Australia, India, New Zealand are excluded. But on others, like on the prospect, like on ASEAN initiative, ASEAN +1 initiative on free trade areas, it is 16. And likewise on lately decided by our leaders on RCEP, Regional Economic Partnerships, it is comprising of 16 countries. More confusing perhaps when East Asia Summit in 2011 was expanded to 18 by adding the United States and Russia as members. President Obama at the Bali Summit in 2011 said that to the United States, East Asia Summit is nothing but a forum of dialogue on political, security, and strategic issues, leaving China being #1 economic partners of countries in the regions would lead the current process toward an East Asia-wide, some 16 countries, free trade areas. On the other hand, America would lead the process of TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnerships. It is interesting to note that some 6 ASEAN countries are joining TPP, while at the same time, of course, being ASEAN members, they are also active participants of the current process of the regional economic partnerships in East Asia. So as I said, the integration process was heavily economics. There's confusing terms. You may know that we have ASEAN +1, ASEAN +3, ASEAN +6, and ASEAN +6 doesn't mean 16 because ASEAN wish to speak as one unit, and that's why I said mathematically it's confusing when about the terms that we are used in these regions. But of course, as a result of this cooperation, you will see East Asia that is very dynamic economically. East Asia that is increasingly seen as the region of the century, East Asia, and for that matter, Asia Pacific, as the center of gravity of the world, mainly, of course, from the economic perspectives. And in fact, we send a confusing signal to the rest of the world by releasing news about the situations or tensions in Northeast and South China Sea. And to me, it is because so far we do not talk much on the political and security sides of the process of integrations. I think this region can learn from what's happened in Europe in the midst of the Cold War. In particular, the conference on security, CSCE, I mean, in which they were able to establish a kind of rule of good conduct and means of peaceful conflict resolutions. Here, we are witnessing that the fact we are not able to respond adequately to the increasing needs for us to respond peacefully, and rather, for that matter, threat and tensions. I believe that, and strongly believe that parties on the current tension and conflict, overlapping conflict on land and maritime space in Northeast and Southeast and South China Sea should go back to the path of dialogue. Because as we have shown in the past, when Indonesia initiated the workshop on managing potential conflict in South China Sea, we were able to gradually at least develop more cooperations leading to the adoptions of 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties. So when I received, for example, a delegation from China in 2010, I was no longer a foreign minister, and they honestly asked whether China's neighbors in this region felt that China is becoming more assertive. I said yes. And in the end, they asked, so what would be your advice? And I said, go back to the path of dialogue. And I think this is what's been absent. We've been complacent since the adoption of 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties, ASEAN-China Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. And at the same time, I think it's time for East Asia Summit to rethink after 10 years, perhaps to elevate its cooperations from a rather loose, leaders-led process into more structured organizations with secretariat in which political and security cooperation should be, it's also an important agenda to balance with its economic cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pak Hassan. Let me begin this discussion session, Q&A session, by sort of trying to identify the big issues, the strategic issues. Now, clearly, the strategic issues, whether they express themselves in competition or in conflict or cooperation, quite essentially, there are issues that are made in Asia issues, made in Asia issues. And they're also because of Asia issues. And external parties obviously come in to crowd out Asia in the because of Asia issues. And then the issues are also because of history issues. Insofar as China is concerned, there's so much history that's brought to the table. And there's a lot of Chinese history that goes back. And if a lot of it is brought to the table, the question is how much of it is going to be contemporaneously applied from its historical depth and history. And in international law, generally, history per se is not recognized as a fact of law. And this is one of the problems in the South China Sea. So, I mean, Arne, Professor Tao, you brought up history, whether recent or ancient, in respect of Japan or in respect of South China Sea. Now, how is it going to express itself today in a contemporaneous world? And insofar as ASEAN is concerned, it's doing something, creating something new, plusing everything, plus. But it must deliver in terms of conflict resolution, in terms of negotiation. It must speak more effectively as one voice if it is going to be effective. Or Indonesia must take the lead as being the largest country. So essentially, that's essentially the things that we have to think about. And so on that note, can I invite the first question? Just wait for the mic, please, Kishore Mahbubani. He doesn't need to identify himself. I've identified him for you. Kishore.
Thank you. Since my question is for Professor Tao, I should also add that I'm also Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Professor Tao, I agree with you that under the leadership of President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang, China will develop the #1 economy in the world. I agree with that. But when China becomes the #1 economy in the world, the big question the world will ask, how will China behave when it becomes #1? And specifically, if you look at what America and the West have done, they created a global multilateral architecture that benefited the West and benefited the rest of the world, like the United Nations, IMF, World Trade Organization. So my question to you, Professor Tao, is when China becomes #1, what kind of global leadership will China provide? Will you support the UN? Will you keep the IMF? Will you strengthen the WTO? Or will you start all over again?
Thank you, Professor.
Well, here we have to make distinction. China's #1 is very much different from US #1. US #1 is a comprehensive strength, economic, military, etc. China's #1 is just the GDP, just the total economy. While China still have a lot of issues, and the GDP per capita is still very, very low, maybe just 50 something or like this. And China's military is far behind the United States. Yeah, of course, China should take more responsibility as we say, with power comes responsibility. China should provide more public goods to the international world. But of course, China will not change its present regime. The United Nations will be there, WTO will be there, IMF will be there, World Bank will be there. So we have nothing to be afraid of. But of course, we will push forward for kind of a reform of these international structures and institutions. So we understand quite well. Even China became #1 in total GDP. China is still a developing country. And we still have a lot of issues to deal with the degradation of the environment. Today, maybe in Beijing, it's a smoggy day. Yeah. And we have a lack of natural resources. We have equality of urban-rural area. As yesterday it's mentioned, the urbanization is still a long, long way to go. Yeah. And our financial liberalization is also a long, long way to go. So we still have a lot of issues to deal with. Nothing to be afraid of.
Yes, Arne.
That was a very good question from Kishore and a very good answer from Tao Wenzhao, I thought. I share Professor Tao's view that China is not a revisionist power. It is not out to undo the global system the way it has developed under first British and then American hegemony. The problem is rather the opposite, I find, that China is being a little bit too comfortable within the system that has been set up, that it is not willing to provide global or in some cases even regional leadership for the kind of negotiations that need to be had on a broader international scale. It seems to me that very often what the Chinese leadership is after is not to try to change anything in terms of global or regional structures, but it's just to get more for China within the structures that exist at the moment. That may be good for China, but it's not particularly good for the kind of international leadership that we need, particularly with the United States, I believe, over a long period of time, and again, I agree with Professor Tao on this, probably playing less of a role in terms of leadership at the international level than what it's done for the past generation. So what we need from China is more leadership, getting more stuck in on the key issues that are there in regional terms, but also in global terms. And that's what I hope we will see under Xi Jinping's leadership.
Yes, please, I see the gentleman there. Can you wait for the mic to come? Yeah. Second row. Oh, sorry, it's the third row.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on that statement you said.
Please identify yourself.
Continental area. What kind of leadership would you like China should have globally and regionally? The second question I want to ask is, well, the Philippines has officially put the South China question before the UNCLOS. Will that create greater uncertainty or greater certainty on this issue? Where would ASEAN play a role in that context?
Thank you. Arne.
Yeah. Well, the others may wish to comment on this as well. What kind of leadership is needed from China? Well, first and foremost, leadership on the big issues that affect us all on a global stage. Issues such as climate change, such as the international economic order, such as financial regulations on an international and global scale. Those are the big challenges. But then there are also security challenges of a more specific kind when China's leadership is needed. Now, it's easy from the Chinese point of view to say, what's happening in the Middle East doesn't really affect us, or it only affects us tangentially. And China was probably right in saying so for a very long time. They're not right in saying that today. This is not a part of the world that can be left to the United States and China can opt out of. China needs to take its own positions, not just as a reflection of the overall Sino-American relationship or China's growing relationship with Russia, but in terms of what the Chinese want to achieve, not just for China itself, but in terms of stability, in terms of negotiations, in terms of mediation roles that are taken internationally. In order to do that, China needs to start within its own wider region. And this is why what is happening now with regard to the Korean Peninsula, in the relationship with Japan, and maybe first and foremost, as both the other speakers underlined, with regard to Southeast Asia, sends a signal about how China is going to behave when it has truly risen, going back to Kishore's question. So this is important, not just in terms of what is happening now. It is very important in terms of how China will be seen for the future. Then very, very briefly on the negotiation process. I think the best proposal that is on the table at the moment is the one that the Indonesian government has put forward about returning to an extended code of conduct in terms of how the South China Sea conflict is going to be handled. I think taking that as a starting point, avoiding the kind of skirmishes that have been taking place far too often and could easily flare up into low-scale military conflict. We are not very far away from that at the moment. And that is the way to go now. But that is just a stepping stone, as Hassan pointed out, to much broader negotiations that need to be had. But what we need to do first is to stabilize the situation that is there now, which is potentially very unstable, and then to move on to negotiations.
Thank you. Hassan.
On whether or not UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, creates certainty or uncertainty with regard to relations among countries in the regions, in particular in dealing with the maritime issues. Actually, the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention provides certainty in terms of relations among states on matters of sea in the world. It creates uncertainty, not by the UNCLOS itself, by the loose interpretations of states with regard to the norms, expansive norms, which was negotiated for over than 25 years. For example, the UNCLOS practically outlawed, if not recognize the historic claims in these regions throughout the negotiation process. Philippines claims an expanse of water under 1848 treaty between the United States and Spain, but it was rejected. Many countries claims for more than 400 miles of fishing area. It was rejected. And the law of the sea creates certainty on the maximum limit of territorial sea, the exclusive economic zones, and the continental shelf. But here, as we have heard, arguments that China claims some parts of or islands or rocks in North China Sea as well as the South China Sea based on the history, which is difficult to accept. I will share with you that in 1980, and rather 2009, Indonesian civilian fishing patrols arrested 7 or 8 Chinese fishing vessels, and China strongly protested, and they claimed that Chinese fishing boats were fishing in what they term traditional fishing area. Law of the sea doesn't have any provision on traditional fishing area. Yes, it has on traditional fishing rights. But by saying and arguing that they were fishing in their traditional fishing area is nothing but historical claims which are not there at the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But to me, more than just a question of claims and counterclaims, actually UNCLOS provides mechanisms. There is an International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, and actually the Philippines last year submitted their case to the ITLOS, Hamburg-based court. It was rejected by China. But likewise, yesterday or 2 days ago, Philippines initiated to refer the case to the International Tribunal in The Hague. Again, it's rejected by China. By this, I mean that there was no habit in these regions of peaceful settlement of disputes, be they negotiations, or third-party mediations or adjudications. Actually, China and countries in the region, East Asia can learn from the experience of ASEAN. Indonesia and Malaysia were not party to the compulsory jurisdictions of the ICJ, but when we have a case of Sipadan, Tiny Sipadan and Ligitan, our leaders, Den Soeharto and Pak Mahathir, Datuk Mahathir said that we should not inherit this conflict, this problem to the future generation. That's why they agreed to refer the case under special agreement to the International Court of Justice. Likewise, this dispute between Singapore and Malaysia. And this is what I mean that the East Asia Summit as a forum should not only talk about the economic and trade and what else, but also should discuss this more political and security aspects.
Thank you very much. Would you like to say something, Professor Tao?
Well, I think, yeah, this is a very concrete question, yeah, and we may sometimes we may have a special conference to go into all these details.
Okay, Professor Danny Kwa.
Thank you. I wonder if the panel feels that there has sometimes been too much of an attempt to straitjacket the discussion of our international and regional relations in Asia, surrounding China in particular. When you think about three of these dimensions that we have discussed today, the Sino-Japan relation, to take that to begin, I happened to be in Beijing at the time of the worst of the Senkaku Diaoyu dispute. And there, what I observed was China's government actually working very hard to calm down agitation among its people. People in Beijing were on the verge of attacking Japanese cars, Japanese restaurants, and I think all of us agree that China's government did the right thing to try and dampen the enthusiasm for worsening the situation. And that seems to be, following Professor Tao's statement about how this is very much an important dimension in which we need to think about Sino-Japan relations, that distinction between what the government did and what the people wanted is actually quite important. Now, in contrast, when we think about Sino-US relations, the issues are much more bread and butter. They have to do with the American people feeling that China has stolen all our jobs. It's destroyed our industrial landscape. Something must be done. And how the US government responds to that will be very different from how China's government responded to China's people's agitation over the Senkaku Islands. And then thirdly, the third arrow of this discussion, the Sino-ASEAN relations, there, an uncharitable interpretation is that this is nothing more than a land grab for natural resources from all sides, and that there are riches there to be had, we need to exploit them, and somebody wants to be there first. And it seems to me that here, the scenario is completely different from the Sino-Japan, Sino-US discussion, because here there's real room for collaboration and joint production.
Thank you. So, a comment, an over-obsession with China's central role, need to consider also, the bigger issues and the bigger approaches that China makes, and not, be too focused on the specifics alone. Arne?
Yeah, I basically agree with you, Danny. I think, and this has to be seen within the broader frameworks that we talked about earlier on. It also has to be understood in terms of change. I mean, all of this is happening, as you know better than anyone, within global processes of change that are going to have a tremendous impact on what this region looks like a generation from now. So, in order to understand what is going on within international affairs, we have to look at the world as a whole. We have to go beyond, as Hassan was saying, we have to go beyond what is purely international affairs or diplomatic. And I think at LSE we've done a fairly good job of pushing in that direction. I mean, looking at this at the global level. I entirely agree with regard to the need from a government perspective to contain, to curtail nationalist excess within their own populations. I think, and I think my good friend Wenzhao would agree with me on that the Chinese government's record on that is mixed. I mean, there have been cases in which the Chinese government has been doing a fairly good job in making sure that nationalist agitation do not go overboard and threaten relations with other countries. But there are also problems, some of which are historical, that come out of China's past in terms of how China's communist government has handled the nationalism issue and tried to mobilize it for its own purposes. Actually, on this, China is not all that different from the rest of the wider region, and I think it's important to realize that. One of the reasons why Eastern Asia is not heading back towards a Sino-centric system a la mid-Qing, mid-18th century, is that Chinese nationalism in its modern form comes up against a host of nationalisms elsewhere that are equally intense and equally, well-based in terms of the views of the population than what China's own nationalism is. Now, this does not necessarily predict conflict, but it certainly indicates, as my co-discussants were saying, that one has to be very careful in how these kinds of conflicts are managed.
Well, there are differences between China and the United States towards the Diaoyu Islands issue. The U.S. Your Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary, said again and again, because because the Diaoyu Islands is now administrated by Japan, so the U.S.-Japan military alliance is applicable to Diaoyu Islands. That means if there's a military conflict between China and Japan, then U.S. As an ally of Japan would assist Japan to protect the Diaoyu Islands. While China said U.S. is not the third party of the dispute. U.S. should not involve the U.S.-Japan military alliance into this territorial dispute between China and Japan. So let us do our dispute by ourselves. Well, with regard to the South China Sea, we also have some differences. The U.S. position is to ASEANization and internationalization of the disputes, maritime disputes, and between China and other some ASEAN countries. While China's position is this is disputes between China and direct claimants. So the disputes should be solved through the peaceful negotiation between China and direct claimants. So we have disputes between China and the United States in these two issues. And I think this is probably a very big issue between China and the United States because, as I just mentioned, the new type of great power relationship does not change the basic character of Sino-American relations. That means our relationship is still relationship of cooperation and competition. While in the following decades, not just the decade probably, the major competition between China and the United States probably comes from the Western Pacific. The United States does not want China to challenge U.S. supremacy in Western Pacific. And some American scholars even said to us, if China said to U.S., we will not challenge your supremacy in Western Pacific, then China and U.S. can be harmonious between themselves. Because in the Asia continent, United States recognize China's dominant position. While in the Western Pacific, China cannot challenge U.S. supremacy. So I think this is an issue for us to deal with probably for the next decades, not just one decade. So it's a long, long issue.
All right, we have time for one final question or comment, if any. Yes, please. On the far right here. Front row, far right. Please identify yourself and ask a question.
Hi, Jun Xiang from University of Malaya. I have a question regarding China's military spending. As following media's portrayal, the military spending has more than doubled over the last decade, and some analysts estimate that China will have a military budget in 2015 larger than all major Asian economies combined. Now, my question for Professor Tao and also Professor Westad is this increase in military budget a natural occurring phenomenon for a growing country like China? Or is it due to a specific consequence because of the regional conflict due to a territorial dispute? And secondly, will this increase in military spending put additional pressure on the foreign government and snowball into this awkward situation in between these foreign governments? Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Tao, please.
Well, yes, in the past decade, China's military budget doubled. But, there's a background. Because in the 1990s, we had a very little military budget increase. As Deng Xiaoping said, the military has to be patient. So at that time, the military actually was very, very patient. So China's military was very much behind China's economic development. So in this century, we increased our military spending because of a lot of reasons, because we improved our military's living standards and also with some new weapon systems, etc. China's military should be corresponding to China's size, territorial size, China's maritime situation, China's population. Yeah, because China is such a large country. Yeah. But at present, China's military budget still accounts for just 2% of China's GDP, while in the United States, it's more than 4%. So if you compare China's military budget with other countries, it's not very outstanding. But this military budget increase is not targeted for instance, China's difference with Japan or with ASEAN countries. Even without such kind of disputes, China still have to increase its military budget.
Arne.
I'm not particularly concerned with the size of China's military budget. I mean, I think the Chinese probably could spend their money more wisely on other things than spending it on military equipment, but that's their decision. I am concerned with how China uses its military potential over time, which is quite another matter. I mean, and this is, again, as Professor Tao said earlier on, this is interlinked with the different kinds of situations that China will be facing, particularly in its region. It would be extremely detrimental to China's future position with regard to Eastern Asia as a whole if China started throwing its military weight around. Now, if we look at this at the global level, however, it is important to underline what Tao Wenzhao just underlined at the end. The idea which is prevalent in a lot of places, including I've seen in some press commentary in this part of the world, that China is catching up with the United States in terms of military potential, is almost exactly wrong. It's almost the other way around. China is falling further and further behind the United States, both in terms of military spending, but also probably in terms of overall military capabilities. And the reason for that goes with the figures that we have. The United States is still outspending China vastly in terms of what is going into military armaments. And the difference is not decreasing, it's increasing. And of course, this will have very significant impact for what the future is going to look like. Now, I'm not sure, as I said at the start of this comment, whether that will be overall to the American advantage in terms of the overall economy, in terms of where the United States needs to concentrate its resources as its share of the global economy is shrinking.
Well, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of this first session. And in a sense, China is already number one. We've been discussing China most of this morning. And obviously, because, as Arne said in his address, it is at the center of the region. And the American role as number two in the region is to be stabilizer as number one and number two. And therefore, China's role is the most critical for the region. It finds expression in many disputes and issues that are outstanding, and China has to demonstrate a kind of leadership to solve these disputes, to show that it can be a real leader in the region. And that's something that everyone hopes can happen. And we hope, situations do not give rise to perceptions of fear for China. Situations even like the MH370 incident and the kind of populist diplomacy that became evident is something that was quite remarkable and scary. And if that's the kind of leadership that China is going to show, there'll be a lot of fear about how China would behave in the future over bigger issues. But let's hope that the negotiation, talks and so on will result in peaceful resolution of many of these outstanding issues, whether based on history or other things. And I think in doing so, regional states have to be more assertive as well of their rights and better organized and more expressive. And in ASEAN, we need to find that greater expression and greater assertion. And we need a leadership as well in ASEAN, which can only come from Indonesia and perhaps from the 5 founder members of ASEAN in total. And if there is greater dynamism and engagement, there might be a better result. And there's a better understanding by the United States that regional powers are playing their part, and then the US can be this stabilizer that Arne says, the role that it should play. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have set a scene, and I'd like you to join me in thanking our speakers this morning, and thank you for your participation as well.